This week's facilitated discussion will focus on family communication and individual identity. After reading this week's chapter, I've come to understand how difficult it is to sometimes place our individual identity or identities within the context of our family. Chapter 7 explores this idea. It's titled Communication Accommodation Theory and Communication Theory of Identity. Both obviously focus on communication and communication within families and its ties to our identity. The first theory I'll discuss is Communication Accommodation Theory, or CAT. CAT is the study of how we adjust our language and how it converges and diverges with one another. Convergence is when we adapt our communication, our speech, vocal patterns, and nonverbal gestures with someone else to reduce social differences. I thought of the term code switching when I was reading about this theory. Divergence is when we accentuate speech and nonverbal communication between ourselves and another person. An example of this is when a judge enters a courtroom and everyone is asked to stand to their feet until the judge sits. CAT also suggests that this type of communication may be adjusted asymmetrically, and this means that adjustments may not be matched by the other individual. An example of this could be when a parent does not adjust their communication style to their teenage child because this doesn't fit with social norms. However, when this idea is flipped, it's perceived as condescending to the older adult if the younger person simplifies their language or talks louder. This leads to less satisfaction in the relationship. The main concept of CAT is how we take in messages, decode them, and use them to make sense of our identity and relationship with others. The two terms that are part of CAT are accommodation and non-accommodation. These behaviors explain how we try to meet the needs of conversational partners. The result of accommodation practices usually end with positive outcomes. The goal is to minimize social distance, and non-accommodation practices usually end with negative feelings and increased feelings of distance. In practical application, CAT is used to study how families navigate discourse management. Today, as more and more families are diverse, CAT can be used to navigate the differences that families have, for instance, in multi-generations living in the same household, interfaith families, and I can even see how CAT applies to family members who may have different levels of education or socioeconomic status. The evaluation of CAT has benefits as well as limitations. The first limitation is CAT focuses on interactions between two people instead of multiple people in the family. CAT also does not consider family history and dynamics in understanding communication. And lastly, CAT doesn't account for our conscious versus unconscious motivations for communication. Next, I'm going to move on to the second theory from Chapter 7, Communication Theory of Identity, CTI. CTI focuses more on complex family dynamics than CAT. CTI understands that communication is central to a person's identity, and how an individual interprets and views oneself is central to how we present ourselves to others. CTI has 4 layers of identity: personal, enacted, relational, and communal. The main focus of CTI is that there are overlaps in these 4 layers. Mainly 2 that are featured in our text are the personal relational identity gap, and that's when our perception differs from others' perceptions of that person, and personal enacted identity gap. This is when one presents oneself during a social interaction in a manner that's different from our own perception of ourselves. And I can identify with this identity gap. I tend to do this when I'm giving a public presentation or speaking to people I am unfamiliar with. I may appear more confident and knowledgeable than I actually am at that given moment. Identity gaps are evident in multiple family types. For example, blended families may have identity gaps between step siblings and step parents or half siblings. CTI can examine how these layers of the self-concept may have a gap with the relational layer with the family member or members, as well as the communal layer, in which the individual struggles to find his or her place in the family dynamic. There are limits to this theory as well. The layers are clearly identified, and we understand that they are dependent on one another, but that can make separating the layers to understand them difficult. Both CAT and CTI try to understand and explain how we communicate who we are, how we interact with one another, and how we manage the different identities we have within and without the family context. By studying these 2 theories, we can have a better understanding of family functioning and the role of family in shaping our communication with others. We can also learn from the tenets of CAT and the CTI identity gaps to help manage discourse we may have or we may find within our own diverse families with accommodation behaviors to help minimize identity gaps and create higher relational satisfaction with others in the family.